and defunding scientists who are doing great work. And that's going to hurt the country. We're worried, say, in the United States, that there are systematic and systemic disadvantages to children, Black children, say, in inner cities in the U.S. What we should be doing is looking at that educational system and giving them a leg up so they have better opportunities. Horrendous things is that at least two journals, Royal Society of Chemistry and Nature Behavior, have more or less said that when it comes to articles they'll accept that are scientifically correct, if they might offend people, they won't publish them.
Conversation, and I'd encourage everybody to go and have a look at it. You can see that she's clearly visibly upset.
Yeah.
And what happened to her?
But I also was an advisor to Obama during his campaign. We don't want equal outcomes because people don't have equal talents.
Life, in principle, never ceases to hold a meaning for each and every person.
Lawrence Krauss, thank you so much for joining me. I can't tell you how much of an honor and a pleasure and a privilege it is to meet you, even if it is virtually. I can see Nova Scotia in the background, but this is an incredibly important mission, an incredibly important time. Your book will be released in Ireland, The War in Science, in September. In advance of the release, there's approximately 20 accompanying YouTube podcasts on the origins and podcasts that I want to direct people to as well. But thank you so much for being here, Lawrence.
Thanks. It is good to virtually meet you. I'd rather be in Ireland right now. It's a nice. I like Ireland a lot. But just so you know, this looks like Nova Scotia. It's actually Prince Edward Island, which is a small island right off Nova Scotia, where Anne of Green Gables is from. But I just wanted to make that in the issues of full transparency. It's not Nova Scotia. It's Prince Edward Island. Other than that,
it looks stunning either way, and I'm very envious. Okay, so the first and obvious question is, in this war on science, we need to understand who are the protagonists and what is the battleground. Where is the battleground?
well, to be frank, there are two fronts. This book, I'll show, and by the way, the cover in the UK will be the same, I'm pretty sure. So it's out in the US now. This book is about an internal battle that's happening, a culture war battle that's taking place at universities, academic institutions, scientific institutions, and has been going on for a decade, exacerbated in the last maybe 5 or 6 years, for the heart and soul of science, if you want, and more importantly, for the process of science, free inquiry and open debate, which is central to science. Science is dialectic, and without free speech and open inquiry and vigorous debate on every idea, and namely, nothing should be sacred. I see Christopher behind you, and nothing is sacred, and that's the key point. Everything should be open to debate, and I've been fighting for that for most of my life, and it's certainly not just useful to science, but you can't do science without it. So that's one, and we'll get into that, and that's what the book's about. At the same time, because of what's been going on in a number of institutions in the West, and it's not just the United States, it's UK and Canada and other places, at least in the United States, there's been a counterreaction. And that counterreaction has produced a different war on science, an external war, which is in many ways as dangerous or more dangerous in the short term, at least, because the notion that I hate to use the word woke, but the wokeness that's going on in academia, it is affecting academia, has caused at least the Trump administration and many of their supporters to decide that all of academia is lost, and that the fact that Harvard had rampant anti-Semitism and discriminating against Asian males in its selection of students, etc. That's all true, but the notion that all scientists are therefore woke and therefore the whole scientific enterprise has to be attacked is terrible. Instead of dealing with a scalpel, you're picking a sledgehammer, and it's hurting the country tremendously and hurting the world, because Harvard, for all of its failings, is still one of the places where the best scientific research in the world is being done. And most of those scientists, by large, I'd say the large overwhelming majority of the scientists, are basically just keeping their head down and trying to avoid the whole thing. Now, that may not be honorable behavior, and then some people have said, well, now they're getting what they asked for. But I don't think Schadenfreude is a really useful emotion in general. And what's happening is that they're hurting the scientific enterprise by getting rid of large, important projects and defunding scientists who are doing great work. And that's going to hurt the country for generations, potentially. Now, it may not hurt science worldwide because scientists will go elsewhere. And one of the pieces in this book is by Neil Ferguson about what happened in Nazi Germany. It can happen. Nazi Germany had the best universities in the world before the Second World War, and Berlin and Heidelberg, all scientists at least went there de rigueur. But then, because of ideology, they ultimately got rid of those people, 28 Nobel laureates, and those universities went kaput, and Germany was no longer the scientific leader of the world. That can happen. And so if these kind of things happen and the government defunds science, gets rid of science projects, and the people who've come into the country to do them, makes it difficult for the best and brightest young students in the world to come study in the United States, it's going to hurt the United States more than anything else. And scientists will vote with their feet and move elsewhere. But that's a very different war. It's war that needs to be fought at the ballot box and the public and legislatures. And this is a war, I think, that needs to be fought internally and to some extent externally. The reason I put together this group was there are obviously serious problems, and I thought of writing a book about it. But I think better than a book by me, which could be labeled anything, however you want to label Lawrence Krauss, and a lot of people have different labels, not all pleasant ones. And if I got a diverse group of scholars, and by diverse I mean among all disciplines, to show it wasn't unique to physics or something else, and also whose politically aligned, not allegiances, but our political orientations, amongst not all of them, but some of them are well known, are left and right. They span the spectrum. It could be called a right-wing attack on science or a left-wing woke attack on whatever. And so the idea was, and it was also important to get people from inside. There are a lot of really eloquent people who've spoken up about these problems from the outside, and I know them, and you probably know them, and I've done podcasts with a number of them. But criticizing from the outside is one thing. If we get people on the inside to talk about what's going on, then I think it does two things. It helps convince all those faculty who are afraid to speak out that maybe it's time to speak out, that staying silent may not be the right thing to do. And it's necessary, because I'll talk about how one of the real problems are upper-level administrators who have no backbone and are just virtue signalers. But the other thing it'll do is show the public that people inside are concerned, and the public can have that effect. Of course, it can have that effect in legislatures by affecting their choice of governments, but they can also, have that effect on their donation dollars for universities, on where they send their kids. And those are the kind of things, unfortunately, that academic leaders, university leaders who used to be scholars and intellects and are now largely salesmen, in my opinion, they'll respond to. So anyway, that's the war. This book, and the book was finished, for better or worse, before Trump was elected, although I did add an addendum to my introduction, and one or two people added one or two things. So people often say, well, wait, you're ignoring the other war. Well, there is another war going on, but this one hasn't gone away. And the Trump administration has done some things that are, that helped and a lot of things that hurt. But this ingrained culture war is hurting science and hurting scholarship and hurting education, and therefore hurting the world, because I think science is necessary to meet the challenges of the 21st century. That's my long answer.
What's at stake, Lawrence? Like how serious is this war? Are we talking a few grants for a few professors, or what's the scale of this?
I think the scale is if I didn't think the scale was large, I wouldn't have done the book. It was to get 30, but worse than hurting cats. But it has permeated universities, scientific societies, journals, and it's affecting the way science is being carried out and the progress of science and the process of science. Now, it hasn't destroyed science, as I tried to make clear. but it's hindering it in real ways, in some fields more than others. And so it's, of course, there's professors being canceled. A few of them are in this book who've been canceled for asking questions or saying sex is binary or something like that. And and but and it's affecting more broadly when universities are allowed to discriminate and not hire white males for positions, which is happening in Canada explicitly, not implicitly. They're allowed by the law to discriminate. The law said two wrongs will make a right. And that's getting rid of, that means that there are a generation of really talented young men who are lost to science. And how can you ever say what the loss will be? You don't know what the potential loss would be there. But the fact that it's getting in the way with the kind of questions scientists can ask, with what's being produced in scientific journals. I mean, as you read here, one of the horrendous things is that at least two journals, the Royal Society of Chemistry and Nature Behavior, have more or less said that when it comes to articles they'll accept that are scientifically correct, if they might offend people, they won't publish them. I mean, that's an anathema to science. So it is deep and it's affecting education. Students are afraid to speak out. Professors are afraid to speak out, and it's hurting. The net impact down the road is, we don't know but what we do know is that if we want the impact not to get worse, we have to change things. And we have to ensure that universities are at least the one place in our society where anything can be questioned, and where open debate is encouraged rather than forbidden, and where dogma is attacked openly, and merit causes ideas and people to rise, not anything else.
Is it fair to say, okay, first of all, if Richard Feynman was going for a job in Canada, he may not be even get an interview because of his
prestigious chairs. Yeah, one of the chairs that allows Canada to hire, they specifically have said, in order to meet the demographic these chairs exactly the same as the demographic background of the country, which itself is ridiculous. University of Toronto and other major universities have said we will not be hiring white males in this position for at least the next 5 years.
We use the word, okay, so the word woke, okay, so that has a pejorative, it has negative effects.
A good idea, right? To find inequity.
Yeah.
What the hell is paved with good intentions? I
mean, it's important just to clarify that the fundamental ideas that underpin the woke, progressive social ideology, I mean, most people would be in favor of those, and people would not dispute them morally, ethically. Everybody, I think, wants to see a fairer world, but it is also reasonable to assume that, are we talking about an overreach, perhaps?
Of course, not perhaps. Right. There are inequities in society, of course, and people of goodwill want to address those. I've been, that's been a large part of my own activities, like it. But you've got to do it in a realistic way, and in a way that doesn't cause more harm than good. And eventually, as always, you have to be governed by empirical evidence and reason, not by dogma. And dogma says there's systemic racism and sexism everywhere, and anything we look at is a consequence of that. Well, that's dogma. Empirical evidence might say to you, if you want to think, or rationality would say, look, if we're really interested in dealing with inequities, the best way to do it may not be at the endowed professor level. If we're worried, say in the United States, that there are systematic and systemic disadvantages to children, Black children, say in inner cities in the U.S., what we should be doing is looking at that educational system and giving them a leg up so they have better opportunities, not down the road when it makes no difference to anyone. It doesn't solve anything. And you might look at actually, what is the impact then of affirmative action? And you'll find out when it comes to gender, that it's had no impact whatsoever, to first approximation on disciplines where there are fewer women. And there are countries where there's clearly more gender equality, like the Scandinavian countries. They have among the biggest gender differences in these disciplines of anyone. And this not only hasn't changed it, but you can also look at the realities of the world today and say, well, in fact, in universities, the undergraduate population in the United States is 60% female and 40% male right now. 50% more females. When it comes to graduations, undergraduate, master's degree, and PhDs, women dominate. And in fact, even in science, women dominate in many, because more of them go into life sciences. So the fact that there's inequities in certain fields is not an example in any way that a rational person looking at the data would say demonstrates systemic sexism. And so you have to fight these things, you can't be like anything. You can't assume you know the answer before you ask the question. That's the problem with religion. But it's also the problem with this new kind of secular religion, which assumes everything resides, it comes from postmodernism. Everything resides in power and oppression and can't be thought of into other terms. And that dogmatic mantra, which can't be questioned, is as religious as any other religious ideology.
It seems as if the two lanes, science and ideology, which should be separated by significant distance, have converged. And it's when those ideology and science converges, rational, pragmatic, empirical, evidence-based science converges with ideology, that is when we have, this is, I think, what you're fighting.
Absolutely. In fact, I think the title of a piece I wrote 4 years ago in the Wall Street Journal, one of the first times I wrote about this, again, in what you might think of a right-leaning newspaper, when ideology trumps science. And I think that is the real problem. Ideology is an anathema to scholarship in the sense that it, as I say, it presumes answers, makes certain things sacred, and forbids debate. And it leads to incorrect conclusions. It leads to pseudoscience and nonsense. It leads to this ridiculous situation where people question whether that biological sex is biological. And I mean, a debate that should not be happening. And what's worse, it leads to the conclusion that if you ask questions about that debate, you're automatically on the wrong side. You're automatically transphobic or anti-gay or anti-trans or whatever it is. It labels people, and people get, instead of listening to their ideas, people get shut down because of who they are, and that's just ridiculous.
In one of the conversations, it's a very moving podcast you do with Carol Hooven, and during the conversation, and I'd encourage everybody to go and have a look at it, you can see that she's clearly visibly upset.
Yeah.
And what happened to her, and you referenced it there, she was a Harvard professor, a Harvard teacher, she stated a biological fact, and her career was destroyed, essentially.
Yeah, her life, I mean, her environment was destroyed, and effectively, therefore, she wasn't a tenured faculty. She was a teacher, and one of the most popular teachers in the Department of I always get this wrong, organismal and evolutionary biology, I think is the title. They separated at Harvard, but I think that's the title. And in addition to teaching, she became head of the graduate program, so she had an administrative position, and she was, as I say, often received the best teacher awards. And because she'd written a book on testosterone, and her expertise, in fact, is sex and evolutionary biology and reproduction, she was asked to appear, one of her novice appearances, on Fox Network, which is an American right-leaning television network, where she said sex is binary, but you shouldn't, that's no reason to be transphobic, et cetera, et cetera. What happened was that a young group of activists, and this is the problem, it's a small group of activists who dominate social media and make it appear as if they're much larger than they are, and then the authorities in question but as well, they responded saying basically they were embarrassed that she was transphobic and she'd said this, it was inappropriate, blah, blah, blah. And what happened was no one defended her, more or less, in the department. And the actions continued, and her class, which had been very popular among graduate students, basically one term, no one signed up for it. The environment became so effectively hostile that she decided she had to retire, that it wasn't pleasant to be there anymore. So no one fired her, but she's put in a position where no one in authority effectively defended her. In fact, basically chastised her for saying something that she should be perfectly allowed to say. And it was an exact example of how things should not be done. And it's not the first time that's happened at Harvard. And it was, I think during the tenure of someone who eventually became president of Harvard, who talked about, and then, Steve Pinker, who writes in our book, I think was one of the first people I heard say this, although a lot of us were thinking it, that, at the time of October 7th and all these ridiculous anti-Semitic mobs that were happening, or at least mobs that were violating university property, etc. It was okay. If free speech was fine if you're going to say kill all the Jews, but not if you misgender someone. And that's exactly what the president of Harvard, who happily is no longer the president of Harvard, had enforced during her time as dean. And there's discussions of that, not just Carol Hooven, but a very eminent biologist, I think Eric Pryor was his name, who had the temerity ultimately to produce a paper that showed that maybe racism in police, I think it was police, or it was not as claimed in the media, and later suffered tremendously for that. Anyway, so that's the kind of thing that, in Carol's case, she's a lovely person, a lovely teacher, and it's a loss for everyone. It's a loss for the students, and it certainly was a loss for her. As you see, she wasn't, she just felt like she couldn't go on anymore and do that. And that's a tragedy. Now, she's having an impact, and a good impact, by speaking out, and her case is having an impact, but I don't think that is any reason for her to have had to suffer as she did.
I was thinking when I was watching it, there was a direct line you could draw between Niall Ferguson's The Treason of the Intellectuals. The upset that was clearly visible in Carol's face had a lot to do with a sense of betrayal. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. She felt betrayed by the people who should have defended her, who in private supported her, but didn't have the guts to speak out in public for fear of what would happen. And then, there's that old famous thing. First they came for as it goes on. And,
yeah.
When I wrote, I realized how severe this problem was probably 5 years ago when I wrote that piece for the Wall Street Journal. Not when I wrote it, because I'm often on the edge and I get upset about things and I write about them. But when I wrote, I got letters from people I didn't know who were academics agreeing with me, but they were all written under either their home accounts or under pseudonyms, because they explicitly said to me, we are afraid of what would happen if our colleagues or our administrators found out we agreed with you. That sounds like the Stasi or East Germany or the KGB in Russia. It shouldn't be the case in a university.
No, it harkens back. I'm thinking of something that Greg Lukianoff said in The Cancelling of the American Mind, 1947 to 1957, the famous Red Scare. Lukianoff said that between 100 and 130 professors lost their jobs. Recently on his website, he points to the fact that it's nearly 1,000 now have been attacked for wrong speak. A couple of hundred have lost their positions. It's considerably worse.
Many more faculty have lost their jobs now than they did during their Red. It was actually under 100, I believe. I think it was only 27 faculty. I've heard Greg give these. I was at a meeting with him where he gave these statements, and I may have the wrong numbers wrong, but it's over several hundred. And so in that situation, when you compare what publicly people are embarrassed about was the Red Scare and blacklisting people, it's small numerically compared to what's been happening in universities, and that's worth pointing out. And it's not just people who are fired or people who resign because the environment becomes hostile. It's people who are censured, or people who are now no longer allowed to teach a certain class because of things. I have lots of letters and lots of examples from people who that's exactly happened to for speaking out. They were the classes they taught. Gad Saad, who I did a podcast with, and not one of the 21, but he wrote one of the pieces here, pointed out that when he was writing about these things, and he's been writing them for a long time, basically the course he used to teach was taken away from him. He was assigned these other classes, and graduate students wouldn't take his classes. So it can be, there are these sometimes soft cancellations that hurt everyone and often are the result of activism. That's another word. Ideology is one, but activism. No, I used to not think activism was such a bad word, but it should not be the mantra of universities to be activist. And I think the epigraph for the book, I have 3 quotes, and one is from Lawrence Summers, the former president of Harvard. He said, universities need to abandon the concept that they have a central role in moral education. And another one from Heather McDonald said, the university has no capacity to eliminate hate, nor should be that mission. Universities are not there to teach people what's right or wrong or advocate for what's right or wrong. They're there to teach people to think so that ultimately, hopefully, society can lead to what's better, right or wrong. But one of the people here, Abigail Thompson, is a mathematician at Irvine, writes about 2 departments in her university, where the department website says, a degree in, I think this is Latin American studies at Irvine, is a degree in activism and social justice. It's not a degree in learning about the scholarship and the history of Latin American countries and their cultures and all the things you might think you might study if you took a degree in Latin American studies. It's a degree in social activism. And that's horrendous, because that's not what university should be about.
What about, we have to talk about historical injustices and consider historical injustices in the context of what's happening in society today, right? It seems as if what they're asking, the social activists, the progressives are asking, is a rebalancing and a redress scheme for historical injustices. What's your perspective on that idea?
I think, just like you spoke, there's an old saying, you shouldn't suffer the sins of your parents. And I think it's true. A friend of mine just said that, as you are an atheist, but they came up with a good Onion headline that says something like, we have to do redress to the dinosaurs because of Eve, they had to become carnivorous. So where does it stop? I think at some point we live in a world that we live in today, and we can't affect the past. We can affect the future by how we act today. And all we can try and do today is act correctly. And to discriminate now because of past discrimination is clearly, as I say, 2 wrongs not making right. To be intolerant now because to fight other intolerance is not the solution. It's one of the things the Trump administration, you may not like diversity, equity, and inclusion, but you can't forbid people talking about it. And you might think that universities are overwhelmingly liberal, and they are. But what you need to do is ensure that the best people get hired based on merit, even if they're conservative. You can't say you've got to hire 6 conservative faculty, because it doesn't solve the problem. Those faculty will always have an asterisk next to their name. And so you can't fight intolerance or past discrimination with discrimination today. You can do it, but it's inappropriate. And I think ultimately it creates a sense of victimization of people who literally haven't been victimized. It gives people the sense today that they're victims because of their identity, because in the past, people with that same identity have been victimized. And we live in a culture now where everyone seems to want to be a victim. And I think it's a real problem because, and people who are offended are somehow seen as victims. But as my friend Stephen Fry points out, being offended gives you no special rights at all. It just, what you do with it is important, but being offended doesn't big deal. I offended you. Okay. Do you want to talk to me about it? Do you want to, and so, I think, we should never hide the sins of the past. We shouldn't whitewash history, as is often done when I was a student in the history of Canada or the US or England or Ireland, for example. But so we should recognize the past because it helps us behave better in the future. And a favorite quote that I used to think was from Mark Twain, but my friend Stephen Baker informed me it wasn't, is nevertheless, it's my favorite quote, which is that history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure rhymes a lot. And I think, so we need to study that to make sure we're careful. But you can't redress the ills that have befallen people who are dead. They're dead.
Christopher Hitchens always used to say, your friend used to say, and my hero used to say that when somebody would say to him, "I'm offended by what you said," he'd reply, "What's your point?"
Yeah, exactly. So what do you have to?
What can I do with that?
Yeah, exactly. You want to have a discussion. Oh yeah. wrote about it, and Stephen did. They're great. They're both lovely. And yeah, and as you point out, I'm very fortunate that he was my friend. Anyway, and we'll all miss him, but we all try and do a little bit. No one can fill his footsteps, but we all try and do a little bit to at least preserve the legacy of the intellect and the man. Anyway,
The history of science is littered with example with heretics.
yeah,
Right? It's every step along the science journey is an example of somebody challenging the status quo, the orthodoxy, and very often sometimes getting burned at the stake for it.
yeah, yeah.
You know,
So, for sake, if you're, if you're, what's his name? Yeah.
was it Galileo? Socrates was forced to drink his own, was forced to drink hemlock.
No, there's that famous Italian, or what his main, well,
Galileo.
No, Galileo. No, this guy was burned at the stake for saying there were many planets, that there were many stars, and they all.
Archimedes?
No. This was around the time of Galileo. Oh, its name is gone. I should look it up. But and maybe I'll try and multitask. But yes, that's true. But there's an important corollary here, or corollary. We said
Corollary.
That's how I say it, but other people say it other way. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I'm looking up this to just have the world tell me who's burned at the stake, so I could. Giordano Bruno. He was the death for refusing to accept the idea that there were other stars and planets. But I get a lot of crackpot mail. I have my whole life. Well, since I become well known as a scientist, and the most amusing ones are the ones that say to me, "Here's my idea. I have a theory of everything," and everyone tells me I'm crazy. But everyone said Einstein was crazy, so therefore I must be Einstein. Okay? And so the point is, just because people call you crazy doesn't mean you're not crazy. I think we have to recognize. But science, and look, there are heretics. And science, one of the things that we have to recognize is that scientists are people. It's a secret. Scientists are people. And that means there are fads and biases, and people have all these. But what's great is the scientific process has been developed to overcome the inherent biases and fads of science. So it's true that people have been excluded and often ostracized for ideas that later on proved to be correct. But they've been proved to be correct because the scientific process works. Down the road, if their ideas explain the data and make predictions and solve things, the science moves in that direction. And so what we need to preserve is the scientific process. Of course, scientists are individuals, and we all have the biases, and we all tend to. And so when someone comes up with a heretical idea, we tend to be skeptical about it, but that's okay. That's what we should be. If the idea is any good, it's wrong. I mean, I've had that experience in my own way intellectually. I'm very proud of I was one of the first people to argue that empty space had energy in the universe, and it turned out to be correct, and it won the Nobel Prize in 2011. But I remember when I used to go around and give colloquia at universities, eminent universities, at Harvard and Caltech and places. I give the reasons why I thought that was the case, but it was such a heretical idea. And I was proud of being heretical for it. I mean, basically I said, it's so heretical. All the data suggests it should be the case, but it's so crazy that probably some of the data is wrong. It turned out the data was right. But everyone just smiled, and no one took it seriously. No one took it seriously until an experiment was done that actually demonstrated that what we were claiming was right. And those people who did the experiment, even though they weren't looking for what we told them to look for, they were in fact trying to disprove us, at least one of them was, they won the Nobel Prize. And that's okay, because that's, that science is a miracle and it can convince the world. But everyone just sort of was polite and listened, but it was too heretical to be taken seriously. But that's okay. Eventually, it became taken so seriously that one won the Nobel Prize. That happens over and over again. So heretics are important, but just being a heretic doesn't mean you're right. I think that's the important thing that people, there are all these people, I'm besieged by people now who are telling me that, they heard vaccines don't work. The scientific community is a closed community. It's the same thing I used to experience when I used to fight intelligent design. Somehow scientists, we had these handshakes and these secret societies where we only agree to talk about evolution, where in fact, if some scientists could come out and show that evolution did not explain the diversity of species, they'd become famous. We all want to prove our colleagues wrong. That's what most of us aspire to go into work every day to do. And so, but people have this sense that because science nowadays, when it comes to political issue like vaccines, tends to argue uh, on the basis of the evidence that they work, then people say, well, it's closed ranks and all the poor, Now, having said that, scientists and politicians lost a great opportunity. When the COVID first happened, I thought it was a wonderful learning opportunity for people to see how science works. Tentative steps. We make progress. We go in the wrong direction. We self-correct. We test. We do things. And I thought, wow, people can see this. And it was an amazing opportunity because these vaccines were developed on a timescale which is unbelievable, using really neat ideas. But instead, what happened was people closed ranks and said, this is correct. And if you say something else, even if it's not about the science, but whether people should mask or we should close schools, suddenly they were ostracized. So what it ended up doing was making people not trust science instead of a great opportunity to see that science works in baby steps. And at the forefront, things are always uncertain.
In defending science from, say, ideological pressures, how do we avoid creating a new dogmatism that kind of mirrors the rigidity that you oppose?
Well, because what we should ask for is that no one that we should beg that our ideas to be attacked as much as anyone else, and that we should say that we're not asking. As I say, DEI has been not only a massive failure, it's been a negative influence and it's corrupted universities. But I'm not saying that I think the bureaucracies are inefficient and negative and hurtful. But I'm not saying that for example, that we can't talk about whether there's we can't ask the question, is there systemic racism or sexism? Those questions can be asked and should be asked. I'm not, I think the evidence is there isn't, but I'm willing to be wrong. And in fact, I'm often excited when I'm wrong. So I think the way we allow it not to be dogmatic is to use the scientific process. Open questioning, supplemented by reason and open debate. And that will always end up fighting dogma and leading in the right direction. The scientific process has worked for 400 years and has taken us from Galileo and Newton to where we are today, specifically because that process overcomes all of the desire of humans to want to believe in dogma. We all do. We all want to believe in things we want to believe in.
What's the most dangerous kind of, we kind of mentioned one, the most dangerous misconception the public currently has about scientific consensus? What's your perspective on the relationship between the public and the scientific community, if you like?
Well, I think it's that lack of trust. The scientists were the most trusted people. Every survey used to say that. Scientists were the most trusted people, and that's been undermined. And that's serious. People always ask me, what's the most this or the best this? And I just don't think hierarchically. There are a lot of problems. That's a big problem. And the loss of faith in science is part of the problem. And I think scientists can resolve it by speaking out openly and allowing public debate and encouraging it. And that's the way to recover trust, transparency.
Has postmodernism had an overwhelmingly negative effect on the pursuit of science or the credibility of science?
It hadn't until the last decade. Before, it was a laughingstock in the sciences. But it's made incursions into the sciences which have hurt. And you see these ridiculous articles in science journals that we used to laugh at when they were in social science journals about the intrinsic, the inherent whiteness of physics, because we use whiteboards in classes or
colonization of math, is it?
Yeah, the decolonization of mathematics. And it's making inroads. That's once again, it's not to say that good mathematics is being done or good physics is being done, but it is making inroads. With Canada, the Canadian government funded a program called the Decolonization of Light, electric magnetism, which is the best physics theory understood. Somehow, it needs to be decolonized because electromagnetic theory in its modern form was developed in Europe, essentially. It doesn't matter where it was developed. And moreover, One of the claims was we need to decolonize it because it's too difficult. We need to make it less difficult.
That's
Which
so patronizing. It's so.
because
Mm.
it's basically saying certain groups cannot do science, so we have to change science. So there's one of the reasons I included an article here by Joshua Katz and Solvit Gold. They're classicists. Well, Joshua's a linguist and more generally, but the article's about the classics department at Princeton. Classics department at Princeton, get this, has gotten rid of the requirement if you're doing a degree in classics that you have to take Latin or Greek. Now,
Kind of defeats the whole purpose of studying the classics, right?
what's the argument for it? The argument intrinsically is, and this is the racist or demeaning argument, is that some groups can't handle that intellectual burden. And we don't want to discriminate against those groups by not allowing them to do our degrees. So we'll just get rid of the very heart of the discipline to allow those people to take the degrees. Well, that not only undermines the intellectual integrity of the discipline, it demeans the people involved. And it's ultimately, racist, sexist, or you pick your favorite.
It's all of those things. Since 2014, which is an epoch, a huge moment in the emergence of, say, social justice, progressive politics, and in Ireland, we have seen great inflation in the universities, right, which is quite staggering. And I just want to give you one and get your perspective on this number. So we've seen the awarding of first-class honours degrees increase in Irish universities, according to an Irish Times article published in November of 2024, increased by 40%. Now, either one of two things are happening. Either the quality of the teaching is suddenly becoming incredibly, amazingly high in Ireland, or there's something else going on there. I say that around this time was the beginnings of the social justice movement, the progressive movement.
Well, look, I mean, yeah, the great inflation is not new. It predates you're young enough. It predates your birth. You know what? Well, I don't know how old you are, but I taught at Yale University in the 1980s, and
I'm 48.
Okay, so in fact, you were alive, but only a child, and I was once taken to task for giving a student a C in a class because by a dean of the college, you more or less said Yale students don't get C's. I mean, so great inflation is a problem, and it's been a big problem, but more generally, I think what makes it more insidious now than before is this notion that that any grading itself is bad, that merit is bad, and that every student excels because not every student excels. So that it's become more ingrained I think in a more insidious way. Not that that the curve is skewed. There's still a curve. People curve, but now it's A pluses, A's, A minuses, and B's instead of C's and D's. But or whatever numerical number your system uses. But now the notion is that somehow, well, in fact, one of the proposals for decolonizing mathematics in California, it said that getting the right answer in mathematics is an example of white supremacy, and encourage people to show their work is an example of white supremacy.
What was the explanation for that, Lawrence? What is the supremacist piece of that?
Well, it's because mathematics has been developed by white people in the West, and the idea of grading mathematics and getting right answers and being precise is somehow white or colonial or whatever. And again, it's racist to say it because, of course, there not only was zero first developed in Arab countries, algebra comes from that algebra, but and there have been great Indian mathematicians who, and it's just. And the point is when Ramanujan, who was a largely impoverished, uneducated Indian boy who discovered an amazing amount of mathematics, when he developed those things, it wasn't because he was Indian, it was because he was somehow a savant. And moreover, the formulas for pi, the power series for pi that he developed are true now after he died and are true in every country in the world. And it doesn't really matter where it's done. And so this kind of insidious notion that certain things are examples of bad colonialist or white supremacy, and that any kind of merit, any kind of unequal outcome is bad, distorts what we want is equal opportunity. We don't want equal outcomes because people don't have equal talents. You don't want me on a basketball team, okay? I mean, you just don't. And you know, it goes in so many different directions. You want people to do what they can do best, and not everyone does everything equally well. So equal outcomes is stupid.
I wanted to ask you, I was talking to a couple of people about the field of physics. Now, I'm not going to go in over my skis here, so don't worry. But a couple of people that would know a little bit about science and the space wanted me to ask you a question about why there have been very few discoveries since Einstein. What is going on with string theory? What is happening in physics? I'm sure you've heard this before. I'm probably not the first person to raise this issue, but what's your perspective?
My perspective is the 20th century is the most successful century in the history of physics, aside from Newton and Galileo. And even though the 19th century had the development of electromagnetism, but it's hard, and the problems get harder, and physics is a victim of its own success in some sense. The questions that are asked are more difficult to ask and more difficult to test. But to say there's nothing that's in science on is just to completely misunderstand the history of physics in the 21st century. After all, after Einstein more or less was quantum mechanics, which is one of the far more radical development in our understanding of nature than either special or general relativity in that sense. But the discoveries that have been made have been immense in so many different ways, in so many different areas. After all, 100 years ago, we thought the universe was static. That was the consensus of scientific wisdom in 1925. And now that the Andromeda galaxy was the only not the Andromeda, the Milky Way galaxy was the only galaxy that existed. Now we know of 100 billion galaxies, each containing 100 billion stars, in the universe that's expanding, that's 13.8 billion years old. Our complete picture of nature has changed in the last 100 years. So I think it's unfair to say that. But it is true that the problems are getting harder, and problems that string theory tries to address are particularly hard, and may not be resolved for centuries, and may not be that important when it comes to understanding how to make a better toaster or a better battery or other things. But they may be important if we want to understand how the universe began. And at some level, I've often said this, one of the problems, as well as one of the virtues of science, is that it produces technologies. Now you may say, why is that a problem? I mean, science produces the technology that's allowed you and I to talk today, allowed me to be alive today at a time, 100 years ago, I might not have been. It's changed the world in so many good ways, okay, back through technology. So people think that if science doesn't produce technology, what's the point? What's the point of trying to understand dark energy or dark matter? What amazes me is that people don't ask that question when it comes to a Picasso painting, a Mozart symphony, a Rolling Stone song. You pick your, whatever you want, or a Shakespeare play. Because they're not associated with technology. That's what makes human being worth being human. That's the joy, our culture, asking questions, the rich intellectual tapestry of thinking of getting a new perspective of our place in our universe by hearing a new song or reading an amazing play or looking at a piece of art. Science does that. And that to me is one of the greatest virtues of science, not just its technology.
You certainly have awakened me to science, like dare I said, as an art. The convergence, the emergence of science as the ability to imagine something, then test and chase it and chase after it, which is kind of there are parallels in the creative between language, the creative arts, between those kind of ethereal, life affirming stuff that the people value, but also in the pursuit of science. As your career has developed over the last number of years, and I've been watching and with great interest, it seems that there is a merging of politics, a fusing of politics into how you feel and think about science. So I want to ask you this question out of curiosity. If the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney approached you and said, Lawrence, I want you to become involved. I want you to take over the academic space in Canada. I want you to make some interventions. Where would you start? What would you do? How would you correct?
Well, I wouldn't agree to do it. Let me think. Wait here. Various times in my life, I've been offered high-level academic positions, and happily, there was a while when I was interested. But I also was an advisor to Obama during his campaign, science advisor. Happily, I wasn't asked to go to Washington, but I wouldn't have, because I think if I want to be free to say what I feel, and if I'm representing a government, I lose that ability. I lose the ability to speak out for myself, and I have to, because I'm representing a far greater group than myself. And I think I can be a more effective voice to criticize or at least make suggestions. But having said that, what the government should clearly do is a few things, and that's recant several of its policies that have been bad. One is this notion that Canada research chairs, the biggest endowed chairs in Canada, have to represent the background demographics of the population exactly. One is there's an online hate crimes bill that's been proposed in Canada that's very similar to what's going in England. That is even worse, because it says if the government thinks you're going to make a hate statement, they could shut you down.
Minority Report, it's thought crime.
It's the worst. It's worse than. But the other thing this may seem more controversial, we have to stop this virtue signaling about Indigenous knowledge in a way that, in my opinion, demeans them and demeans society. They should be respected, and their culture should be respected like every other culture that's made part of Canada. But to claim that every event I go to, that these people have been around since time immemorial, when, and in fact they haven't been. They colonized the places that they were at, and moreover, that to allow Indigenous myths. I used to fight intelligent design and attacks on evolution, as you know, religious incursions in biology. But when it happens in the Indigenous area, we allow those myths. I mean, we have museums in Canada and the States that basically say, natural history museums, you should be aware that if you go near this object, it has sacred properties, and if you're pregnant, you shouldn't go near it. I mean, that we would never allow that if it was Christian mythology, but we allow it when it's Indigenous, and we have to start pushing back and allowing reason and empirical evidence to come to the fore there. And again, most Canadians seem to think that 215 or 210 graves were found in a school in Canada that was run by the church or the government for Indigenous peoples, and not a single grave has ever been uncovered.
But didn't Justin Trudeau also believe that it was factual as well?
They did it, and many policies were enacted, and flags were put at half-mast. And at the first time, it may be the case, and the original concern was it was perhaps real, but the evidence is that it's not, and it's about time that journalists and governments started standing up for the fact that there is now no evidence, and moreover, these schools in Canada that have many bad aspects, taking kids away from their families. Also, some people have said they did some good things too, and there was people who are now hung it out. But you should be able to at least talk about that kind of stuff.
Lawrence, finally, I know we're up on time, but I have to ask you about AI. What is going to happen with the incursion of AI into everything that we do? What will happen in terms of teaching? Will we be taught by AI? Will it advance teaching? Will it inhibit teaching? What's your perspective?
Well, I'll tell you first, when I tell everyone who asks me to make predictions, I only make predictions about things 2 trillion years in the future. Reasons for that. One, they're easier to make, and two, no one's going to be around to check if I'm wrong. So I don't predict the future nearby. Many things can happen, and life will change for the better and the worse, and it's up to us to choose. AI is not intrinsically bad, but it can be bad. There'll be lots of people who lose their jobs, but there are lots of people who lost their jobs when we had automation. This has changed people's lives. but it hasn't necessarily made it worse. It's just changed them. The example I often use, and I've written about this, is writing in the 9th, 8th, and 7th centuries Greece, which was introduced in Greece. And Plato and other people, Socrates, all said writing was the end of storytelling because it was, people you wouldn't have memory.
It was the end of the oral tradition in
Yeah,
a
well,
way.
Tradition was
But
the
it
end
advanced it.
of storytelling itself. It was going to destroy storytelling. Well, as a writer, I can happily say that's not the case. It changed it. Now, AI is going to have an impact in many different areas in ways we can foresee and can foresee. Am I worried about it destroying the world in the near term? Not like other people. I think we need to ask questions about what can go wrong. We have to prescient and ask those questions when we're doing research, and that's an important thing, whether we're working out an atomic bomb or AI. But and it's going to change what it's going to, certain fields will be. I happen to think it's kind of interesting. I think it'll be more. I think it'll be more the high end fields like medicine and law. Well, that'll get replaced by AI than say plumbers. But
Yes.
but what is clear, I think, and the worry I do have is that AI is tremendously powerful, and the people who get the best AI will become tremendously powerful and tremendously rich. Now, I like to think that we could live in a society where AI makes things much more productive, and we all share in the fruits of that because we can all spend time at coffee shops listening to music and reading books. Or instead, it'll concentrate wealth into the hands of very few people who have the best AI and displace a large number of other people. And which future we end up with will be up to us. I suspect, unfortunately, it's going to be the latter, but that worries me more than the capabilities of AI.
Speaking of the future, what does the future hold for Lawrence Krauss?
The great thing is I never know. And I think that's what keeps me alive. If I knew what the future was going to be for me, I probably wouldn't want to be around. But the fact that it's surprising, the fact that every day I'm surprised, and I'm surprised if I'm not surprised, is what keeps me, what keeps me going, and what makes science so wonderful. I think I like to say that when we write grants, we lie, and we lie for good reason. When we write grants, I don't write grants anymore, but you used to say what you'd be doing 3 years from now. And that's what you expected to be doing 3 years now. But if you really were doing that, then it meant there was no progress. There might be a really neat discovery. So you say what you think you're doing, and then something comes along, you do something else. So the future, well, this book comes out and I'll be talking about
September.
it.
I'll put a link to it in the description of the YouTube podcast and also in the Spotify and on the audio podcast as well when it comes out.
Okay, it comes out, and we just agreed we're doing an event in the UK in London, October 2nd, with a number of the book, sponsored by the Free Speech Union and also my foundation here in the US. And so that's one thing I'll be doing. I am involved in making some movies, and that's
with Johnny Depp. I think, didn't you make one with Johnny Depp?
No, Johnny Depp and I are friends, but I never made one with Johnny Depp. I made movies with Werner Herzog, and I've been as a villain in one of them. But no, Johnny and I were good friends. But we talked about making movies together, and I'd hoped to do that, but that hasn't yet materialized. But I'm making movies. I'm producing them. The movies I'm involved in now, I'm not in so much. I have been in a bunch, but I'm not in as much as making them happen. But that's another fun thing. We're working on a variety of things to try and promote reason and science, and then there are other books that are in the works that are not scientific, and so I think I've written my last science book. So,
you heard it here first. I think I have a. Do I have a scoop? Do I have a scoop, Lawrence? I hope not. I hope you keep making podcasts. I hope you keep doing that. You've certainly you've enriched my life over the last 20 years. You've inspired me to do many things, and even talking to you today has been an absolute privilege and one of the highlights of my life. So thank you so much. And I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. I hope the book sells just incredibly well all over the world. I think the mission is so important.
That's why I did it. But once I've written it, I can go out and speak, but I can't control how it sells. So I long ago detached myself a little bit from that. But I hope people get a chance to read it, because I agree it's important. And I thank you for helping promote it and for the intelligent and pleasant discussion. Thanks.
It was lovely. My pleasure. Thank you so much, Lawrence Krauss. Thank you.